Philippa, welcome to the podcast. I'd like to start, as I do with all of my guests, by trying to understand what was the inspiration behind your brilliant career, going into floristry and now helping people in creative businesses be better and more successful. So, if you go back to your early years, your school years, was there anything in there that thought you'd take on this amazing entrepreneurial career?
I love the idea of going right back because I think, like everything, it sort of forms our lives and our careers and what we go on to do. So school was really hard for me. I latterly found out that I'm very dyslexic. I tried to work so hard, but there were just so many elements that just didn't make sense. And I remember so clearly the teacher saying that I was very lazy, and I knew I wasn't because I was trying to put all the work in. And I think sort of looking back now, I understand where a lot of the struggles came from. And when I was at school, I just remember having this feeling. I was desperate to finish my education so I could work. That was, to me, this sort of idea of working in an office and working in a city was just such an exciting idea. So I think it was that focus. Can I just get through school, get through education, and just get into work? And I had my very first job when I was 12 years old. Which now I've got three children. My youngest is 13, and the idea of them working at the age of 12 seems extraordinary. But for me, it brought me a level of independence. I loved the fact that I got a paycheck every week. I worked in a local coffee shop, and I loved the fact we were working as a team and we were doing something that was helping other people by just simply serving coffee. And I found it really scary, but it was also really exciting. And for me, I learned so much more working in a coffee shop than I ever was learning when I was at school. It was how to deal with customers. It was the juggling of all the orders, all the sort of simple things. But it was just sort of fascinating learning curve for me at that stage. And I remember so clearly wanting a BMX bike. It was this white and black BMX bike that my parents, thankfully and brilliantly, had no inclination to buy for me. So it was that focus, working in that coffee shop to be able to save up and buy my BMX bike, and the fulfillment that I got from that. And I think that has stayed with me all the way through. So even when I went on to university, I kind of went to university because that's what you did, not because I was particularly excited about what I was studying. And I worked in a cocktail bar, and I loved it. I loved meeting the customers. I loved working as a team. I loved all the potions of putting all the cocktails together and just meeting the most extraordinary people and dealing with really tough, demanding customers at the same time. So that to me was my education as opposed to actually school and university. And I grew up in a small coastal Scottish village, miles away from kind of the bright lights. And I always dreamed of leaving there and moving to the city. The idea to be with the bright lights, the idea to work in an office it was really exciting at the time. It just felt a million miles away from my life. And I couldn't wait to move down to London. So that was always a really big goal. And the creative side, it's kind of interesting because I was very good at art at school. But I sort of had this idea that I couldn't use my art, my creativity in business, that I couldn't work out how I could bring both of those together. And I think for me, that the business was a bit more exciting than the creative side at that time. So I kind of left my art and my creative side behind to focus more on a career and to work effectively in business.
And were your parents encouraging of your entrepreneurial nature? So working in a coffee shop at 12?
Um, I think it's interesting. So I grew up. I was raised by my mum. My parents separated when I was very young, and my dad was an extraordinary character. He was life and soul. He was a deep sea diver. He traveled the world. He was an explorer. He discovered shipwrecks, And he lived life in a very, very different way. And I was just the kindest person. So I think I sort of had that as a role model, that life could be lived in a very different way. You weren't stuck. You could explore, you could go to different places. Whereas my mum she was very responsible and quite serious. And she worked incredibly hard. So I think I had that combination of seeing how somebody was juggling so many things, raising us, having to work incredibly hard, and then seeing my father as the explorer. So were they weren't, I think, yes, they were both really encouraging to be independent. I think they put a huge amount of responsibility on me, which I was so grateful for. So yes, but no. I think on the entrepreneurial side, I remember trying to set up a sweet shop when I was younger. And I would go to a local shop, and I'd buy sweets, and then I'd set up a stall and invite my friends round. And I remember my mum sitting down saying that I couldn't do that. That was sort of a wrong approach in business. So I don't think they were necessarily encouraging from an entrepreneurial point of view, but they were definitely encouraging on the independent side. And I think they were very happy for me to get a job. But that very much came from me.
And the dyslexia, because obviously that holds so many people back, and
Yeah.
many dyslexic people do find they have these amazing creative abilities, and they find ways to compensate. So through your school years, how did you compensate for your dyslexia? How did you use it?
So for me, my dyslexia is my memory. That's the hardest element for me. So I cannot so things like history and dates, I cannot process the information and remember it. It just doesn't stick. Kind of sciences where things is just on a memory basis. Language is incredibly hard. So everything has to be practical, and it has to make sense for me to be able to understand it and remember it. So at school, I was very good at the problem solving aspects. I remember the teachers saying, you're bright, you're very capable, but I would get literally 0 out of whatever the score was for anything that was memory based. And I think it was really difficult. I don't think I did come up with solutions at school, because exams, again, it's just so much is remembering things and regurgitating what you've remembered. So I did really badly in my exams. I just scraped through the kind of the middle age exams. I failed my senior exams. I had to resit them. I then just about managed to sort of scrape into university, which I shouldn't have done. I shouldn't have gone to university. I should have gone straight into work. But it was the kind of, I think it was very expected that that's what you did at that stage. But yes, no, I don't think I ever really came up with a solution to help me at school.
And what did you study at university?
Oh my goodness, I did. I studied geography. Which, only because somehow I managed to get an A in geography when I resat it for the second time. I'm not quite sure how I managed to get that A. That was slightly, yeah, I'm sure that was luck rather than probably making up answers rather than actually knowing the exact answers. And it was interesting. There were elements I love the human element of geography. I loved understanding how cities were built, the way that people moved around the world. That to me was really interesting. But then it was the juggling how you manage your workload with also working in a cocktail bar. I think that was the aspect. It was really exciting, and of course the incredible holidays. And during those holidays, I did a little bit of traveling, but then also working. And one of the holidays, I went down to London, and I can't remember exactly how it happened, but I got an amazing job working at Channel 5. Initially in a call center, because there was some big problem with some kind of something had happened. Channel 5 had done something, and they had to set up a temporary call center. And I was in that call center dealing with really, really upset customers. And it was just brilliant, helping them, listening to them, coming up with the solutions. And after work, I began to meet some of the other people in Channel 5, and I came across the team that looked after all the advertising. And I was so excited about the advertising team that towards halfway through my role during the summer holidays, I was then offered a role inside with the advertising team. And I was responsible for coming up with ideas for different brands and how they would work with the programs. So it was their brands sponsoring different programs on Channel 5. And then working in this office it was just really exciting. I sort of back in my teen years. So I think it's always been about sort of meeting different people and trying to create different opportunities and realizing that you can create your own opportunities. If that makes sense. Yeah, that was an amazing experience.
So tell us then what happened when you finished university. What did you go to do?
So after university, I went straight to London. I got a job working for a marketing company, and I was there for about 6 months. I really, really didn't enjoy it. It wasn't quite the right role for me, and I think I was probably pretty useless at that role.
And why
And
was that? Why wasn't it the right role for you?
The role at the time, I had to start right at the bottom, which I was really happy to do, but it was more about trying to impress the senior team rather than actually doing work. And I really struggled with that. I wanted to get stuck into the projects, and I totally understandably, I didn't have the experience to be able to do that. So it was much more about trying to please people. And those are the people that were really successful, and they were very clever, and they sort of worked their way up through the company. But I struggled with that because I wanted to get stuck into the different projects and actually do something. So I left that role. And I think the company was probably very glad that I left that role within about 6 months. And I slightly randomly fell into recruitment. And it was almost like going back to the call center days. It was sort of a mixture between a call center and working on a sort of trading floor. The office was jam-packed full of people. I was recruiting temporary accountants for big corporates. And I remember I had a tiny desk, I had 2 screens, I had 2 phones, and a job would be called in, and you were competing against about 3 other big recruitment firms. And it was effective. You just had to be the quickest person to figure out what the job was about, which candidate on a database would be the best fit, and getting a hold of that person. So it was this huge, you had to work really quickly and quickly get somebody on the phone. And it was exhilarating and it was exciting. It was a very, very low salary. It was high commission. Your name was on a board behind, so everybody knew exactly how well or how badly you were doing. So it was quite stressful, but also quite exciting at the same time. And there was quite a lot of sales involved. So it was a lot about speaking to other corporates and trying to get their work. And so I was very, very used to an enormous amount of rejection. It was probably about 100 phone calls. You may just get one tiny little bite. So I guess I'd sort of built up a relatively thick skin to people saying no. And also because I was surrounded by people that were doing that as well. So I was very happy to do that. And it was fun. It was my sort of first few years in London. I had a little bit of money coming in and just having a huge amount of fun. And also sort of, getting that experience working in a corporate environment. So I am so grateful for those years because they were really tough and really stressful. But there's so much that I've taken from that and applied that to my business years. And then slowly, my career sort of grew in the recruitment world. Eventually, I worked for a couple of different companies, and I eventually worked for a very small boutique firm, and they specialized in recruiting strategists. So I began to move from finance more into strategy, and we worked for phenomenal brands. So FTSE 50 some in finance, but mainly in kind of consumer goods. There was sort of FMCG type businesses. So people like Diageo. And this company was responsible for recruiting entire strategy teams. So we were working with board level clients and recruiting incredible strategists. So all the amazingly bright people out of McKinsey, BCG. And I absolutely loved these people because they were so bright, but also they either were leaving consultancy and they were going into big corporates, or they were setting up their own businesses. And just their energy and their excitement. And I think it's a particular personality as a strategist. They have to be incredibly bright, but they're also amazing adventurers as well. And I remember the number of times trying to get candidates for an interview, and I would have a phone call an hour before, and somebody had broken a leg because they'd been jumping out of a helicopter. So it was sort of juggling those personalities. And that was really exciting. I think that was the very, very first idea that I had that it was possible to set up a business, and seeing people do that. And I think also for the company I was working for at the time, it was a very small company, and it was set up by 3 people, a husband and a wife and one other of their friends, and seeing how they had built this company. And I was not one of the first to join, but I was part of the initial group. So that then began to give me an idea that it was actually possible to set up a business, like beginning to see people do that. And also working in that role, I got to know my clients incredibly well. I understood what they were doing, but also more importantly, sort of the culture within the companies, and very clearly the exact type of candidate that they were looking for that would work really well in that environment. And then, of course, I got to know the candidates very well, what they were looking for in terms of their career, their prospects, where they wanted to go, but also who they were as people. So that's where I got an amazing level of experience and skill in deeply understanding clients, both the candidates and the clients, and matching them together.
So by this point in your life,
Yeah.
what had you learned? What did you learn about yourself? And what did you learn about what you wanted to do and the skills that you had?
I think by this stage, I'd always considered myself as not being very bright. I think sort of back from school days. And I realized that I was actually much more capable than I initially thought. And also that it was, and I think this is really, really important, that it was okay to fail. I know that's a really classic thing that people say, but I think there are so many times in working in corporate, it was a really, really competitive market, incredibly competitive. And it was okay not to be successful, and how to pick yourself up again. And the other thing that I learned was the importance of listening and understanding people. And one of my previous managers, it's a sort of well-known phrase, but I think when I first started, I was probably quite chatty. And he pulled me aside and said that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and use it in those proportions. And that I still remember that so clearly now. So it was the beginning, it was the understanding how important it was to really listen to people and to really, really understand people. But I began to sort of think about how amazing it would be to set up a business, but I just had no idea how to do that. And I didn't have a strong enough drive to do that at that stage. So I never really imagined myself doing that.
And in terms of your skills, what by then had you recognised you were good at?
I knew I was good. I was very good. I think the biggest thing was I really understood people. I really understood what people were looking for, what they wanted, and what they needed. And yeah, I think that's probably the biggest skill that I knew I had, and also that I was learning and growing into.
Great. So now we know kind of your journey this far. You're working in a boutique in recruitment. You're doing very well. You're looking after strategists. What happens then?
So this is where everything changed. I was married by this stage and I was pregnant with our first child. And I was absolutely going to go back to work again. So I was very much, I was looking at nurseries, I was looking at nanny options. And I was working in an environment where the women that succeeded went back to work very quickly. And I remember a lot of the senior men in particular saying, I remember there was a particular story about this extraordinary woman, and they thought she was amazing because she went back to work, it was something like she'd had a baby that day and she was back in the office the following day. And that was the most incredible story. And I remember thinking, wow, that woman is amazing. I'm going to do that. I'm going to get back into work as quickly as I can. And I was very excited about it. I was very driven by that. And I think because I was that was the world that I was in, and that's what I was inspired by. And I wanted to be successful in my career. And I felt that that's what I had to do. I had to be this superwoman. I had to be able to almost not worry about having had my baby and get straight back into work again. So that was very, very much my goal when I was pregnant.
So what did happen?
And then I had my baby and everything changed. Literally, I remember it so clearly. I remember being in hospital and my eldest was sort of lying in the bassinet or the sort of the crib. It's one of those sort of see-through, the clear cribs that they have beside you. And I remember looking at him and just thinking, this is extraordinary. I've never, ever felt such a deep level of love and responsibility. And there's no way I can go back to work. I mean, I can't leave my baby. It was such a huge, powerful feeling of love and responsibility. And the idea of going back to work was, it had gone completely. And I knew I needed to do something different. And that was almost immediate. It was such an instinctive, feeling.
So what happened then?
So I then realized that, my salary it was really important. We needed my salary as much as my husband's. So I had to come up with something that would enable me to bring some money in, but to be able to stay at home. So I knew that during my maternity leave, I then extended my maternity leave for as long as I possibly could. And I think it was 6 months where it was paid, and then it was token gesture for the following 6 months. So I was going to take an entire year off at this stage. And I knew that I had to come up with a business idea to allow me to stay at home, to be with my son. And I had to be able to match my salary in that year. So that was my goal. And if I was able to do that, then I didn't have to go back into the corporate world again. So there was a lot of thinking that sort of went on at that time. And I came up with this idea that if I could set up a business where I was selling beautifully potted plants, and very inspired by the incredible packaging of companies like Joe Malone and Dalesford. So a very sort of high level luxury gift that had a huge amount of thought that went into it. So almost sort of the opposite of cut flowers. It was something that you could keep and would be with you for ages. So I came up with a brand. I developed the packaging, the whole concept, and it was launched. And because it was quite a unique idea, it received quite a lot of press coverage. And I didn't have any sort of press experience, but because I understood people, because I understood what they wanted, I understood what magazines needed in terms of content, sort of description and the photography. So I made it very, very easy for them to be able to talk about this product. So it was featured heavily. And people began to buy it as gifts. But what people started buying them for, not so much as gifts, and that was very much my intention, was people started buying the plants as table centers for weddings. So people were buying them in large numbers. And I also began to set up contracts with local restaurants and pubs so I could have a sort of ongoing work. And during that time, I brought in just enough revenue then profit, to be able to cover my salary almost. So I was then able to quit my role after that and then go full time into this business. And I loved being able to juggle it. And I found it sort of the combination of having my baby boy and being able to work was just really exciting for me, because I'd always worked really hard through my life. So I wasn't so interested. I didn't mind about not going to all the baby groups and all those kind of things. So my eldest and I, we sat and we made all these amazing business plans. We boxed all these plants very much together with him playing on his mat. And I loved that year. I loved that. I loved the juggling. I loved the fact that I knew there would be periods in the day where he would sleep and I could then make all my phone calls. And of course, when he was then awake, I then sort of worked in other different sort of aspects of the business. And it felt very much like we were doing it together. And the fact that I could be with him just meant everything. So it was it was full on, but it was really enjoyable. And actually it wasn't stressful at that stage. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
So if there are people listening to this podcast who are inspired to set up their own business, what advice would you give them based on that those early years?
I think you have to have a very, very strong motivation. So I think had I not had my baby, the idea of quitting my job and setting up a business, I don't think I would have done that. I think it would have been far too scary. So you need to understand what your motivation is, and you have to have a very, very strong motivation, because it's risky. It's a big, big, big thing to be able to do. And you need to deeply understand your strengths. You have to understand what it is that you are really, really good at to make sure that it's completely unique what you're doing. I think those are the two really, really big things. And also you need to know that it's hard work. And you're going to make compromises. You're not going to be able to do everything. So I had to forgo all the baby groups and all the sort of the mothers getting together, and sad to some extent. But then there were so many other things that I gained from that. So I think those are the three things. You have to have a very, very strong motivation. You have to know that you're going to work incredibly hard. And you have to understand what it is that you are really good at to make sure that you can be completely unique.
And obviously the business was a huge success. So for the listeners that don't know, although production will have given a bit of it away, tell us about the journey from that first year of boxing things and sending them out and making phone calls when your son was napping. Where did you end up?
So one of the things I sort of mentioned earlier with the plants being used as table centers for weddings, the clients that I was working with, and those projects I love because they were rather than them choosing the plants, I got to know my clients very well, and I was recommending plants based on their theme for their wedding, what was really important to them. And they started asking if I could do the bridal flowers. So you'd have the potted plants, which I was able to do quite straightforwardly, but putting the bridal flowers together was a whole nother idea. And I was saying no, because it certainly wasn't something I could do. And I certainly wasn't a florist. There's no way that I could put beautiful bouquets together. But because I got to know my clients incredibly well, sort of linking back from my corporate experience of really understanding clients. And when I was setting up the plants, I saw the other flowers, and I was able to see that the flowers that were being delivered didn't match what my clients were looking for. So I then thought, well, maybe I could put some designs together. So I went out and I bought a couple of flower books, sort of those simple ones. I think one was a Judith Blacklock. I can't remember the other one, but they were these sort of brilliant flower books, how to put hand ties together. And I bought some flowers and I practiced, and I fell completely in love with floristry. And it was tapping back into my creativity that I hadn't really done since school. And there's suddenly this idea that I could take these flowers and I could create this beautiful design. And it was something I was lucky because it came relatively easily to me. I had to practice quite a lot. So from there, that's when the floristry side began. And I remember my first ever project where I was asked, it was nothing to do with plants, it was all flowers. And the bride was coming to my house. She had seen some of the bouquets I had done, and she was very aware that I hadn't actually done flowers for tables before. I was very open and very honest about that. And of course, I didn't have a portfolio, but I spent time to really understand who she was and what she was thinking on the phone beforehand. So I was able to create the table center for her for when she came to the meeting. And it was a simple jug design with flowers coming out. And she walked into the kitchen where I was hosting the consultation. And she just said, that is perfect. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And I think she then gave me the confidence to move the whole business towards flowers. And then from there, it grew and grew.
Go on, and go on. Tell us the whole story. So, I mean, it became a huge business, and then obviously you had that wedding. So, go on. You tell us about how you got to that stage, because for me it seems like a very long way from somebody walking into your kitchen, seeing what you're saying, right? Yes, that's really capable. To where you ended, kind of up.
So I started doing, there's a few more local weddings, and I knew I needed to get into, there was a couple of really beautiful little hotels close by. So it was sort of back to my recruitment days, knocking on doors and being declined and sort of saying, no, we have our florist already. So it was me just persisting again and again and again with the small local venues. And there was one that said sort of, yes, maybe we might be interested. So it was looking for all those sort of tiny opportunities. And then it just simply grew and grew from there. So when I had a small venue, I then began to look at some of the bigger venues. And there was a very, very key point. And this is when the business went from being a very small business to being something that was a little bit more established. There was, at the time, it doesn't exist now, but there was a wedding exhibition called the Designer Wedding Show. And that was where all the big, incredible brands, so the London-based brands, were exhibiting. And I called them, and bearing in mind, I was still working out of my kitchen. I was this tiny, tiny florist, but I loved doing what I was doing so much. And I knew that I wanted to work on bigger projects. I was really excited about doing that. And I thought that if I could have some presence at this designer wedding show, that would put me in front of clients who would enable me to work on some of these bigger projects. And I called them, and they completely understandably said, no way. There's no way you can exhibit here. You're certainly not a big enough brand. And so rather than just saying, oh, okay, and sort of scurrying away, I asked them why. And I asked them what I needed to do to be considered to exhibit, to be able to be invited to exhibit. And they were great. And they took time to explain exactly what they were looking for. And they wanted brands that had press coverage. So, and links with other brands. So I spent more time on the phone, really understanding what it was they were looking for. So rather than just saying, oh, okay, and leaving it, I really got to understand exactly what it was they were looking for. And then over the next year, I steadily worked on gaining the press features and beginning to work with different brands. And that was about understanding, again, what the publications were looking for, and then trying to work out how I could then begin to collaborate with different brands. So just steady, step by step. Again, plenty of rejections. And I began to get some of my features in the magazines. And from that, I began to work with some incredible brands. And then I think it was a year later, which seems an incredibly short period of time. So it might have even been 2 years later. After I had various press coverage, I had a phone call from them asking me if I would exhibit. And I was really good because I didn't say on the phone, did you know, by the way, a couple of years ago, actually, I asked if I could exhibit. And it was, I think the reason was they had somebody pull out last minute. So it was one of those sort of slightly lucky opportunities. And it so happened to be that it was the store, the stand right at the entrance. And I knew this was going to be an amazing opportunity. So we decided to go all in, and we made sure this stand was absolutely extraordinary, and we filled it with just the most beautiful flowers, and it worked a treat. We were very obvious. Before I researched all of the big wedding planners that were going to be there. I understood exactly what everybody looked like. I researched all the other brands that were going to be there. So I made sure over those days I met as many of these people as I could. And I then went around all the other stores and got to know a lot of the other brands. So that was huge for us. And from there, we started to get some of the larger projects, some of the larger sort of weddings and events. So yeah, that was an amazing opportunity. I think it's one of those ones where you work really hard towards it, but then also there's an element of luck that comes into it as well. I think had it been that, firstly, if a brand hadn't pulled up, we wouldn't have had the opportunity. Had it been another brand that had a store right at the back, perhaps we wouldn't have been had that exposure. So there was a bit of luck. So whenever, I think it's that whole thing is when you have those opportunities, you have to jump into them feet first and do them really, really well, and see how you can sort of make even more of an opportunity out of that. So it's not just making the stand beautiful, it's then how can you be proactive, who can you meet, who can you speak to as well. So it's trying to get a huge amount out of that one opportunity.
And Philippa, what would you say is the biggest wedding that you've done?
We've had some huge weddings. There's quite a lot of weddings that we've done that I've still never been able to talk about because they're all under NDAs. So I have worked, oh my goodness, with some of the world's most extraordinary people in some of the most amazing locations, where we've been doing flowers and there's been sound checks by some of the most recognizable singers and bands in the world. It's a whole another world, and I am so grateful for that. So I think obviously the most recognizable, it wasn't the biggest, but in terms of exposure was of course the royal wedding that we did.
I asked you that question just to really emphasize what an amazing journey that you've had. I mean, from kind of being on maternity leave and having an idea about pot plants in Joe Malone style boxes to doing the things that you were doing. But that's been an amazing chapter. But now you're doing something to help others in the creative space. So tell us about that. Tell us about how you've moved on now to wanting to help others.
So I love my role as a florist. I love the clients, the opportunities, the different brands that we worked with. And in addition to sort of private people, I was working with some of the most creative people in the world. So we were doing collaborations with the V&A Museum. I had a collection of hair and sort of brooch accessories of matches fashion. And I absolutely answer your question, but I think it's kind of interesting. It's sort of how far can I take flowers? What else can I do with it? So there was so many different elements. There was the weddings and event side was the largest part of the business. But we also then had an online store. We then had a retail concession in Selfridges. We were white labeling for Selfridges. So we're doing all of their flowers in addition to our own. We then had this collection for Matches Fashion and just amazing collaborations with some of the most incredible fashion brands, a lot of work with big publications as well. And one of as the brand was becoming more recognized, I was beginning to receive more and more questions from florists, specifically about how do they put designs together. And I have felt so lucky and fortunate with all the opportunities that I had that I was really excited to begin to help other people. And I was so happy to share how I put these designs together. So there was probably on a daily basis, we were getting sort of one or two different emails. And it felt there was the need there and the demand. And it felt like the next step would be really sensible to set up a flower school. So we had florists coming in from all over the world. And we were specifically teaching them how to put designs together. So archways, table centers, the list sort of goes on. But more and more people were beginning to ask, or florists were beginning to ask for business advice. And so as we were playing with flowers, not playing with flowers, but designing with flowers, the questions were beginning to ask about how I structured the business, how I looked after marketing, communication, how I managed to get the press features, how I was able to work with these different clients. And there was one particular group, and they were asking more questions than normal. And they were in for 5 days, and every single day had been pre-planned, all the different designs we were creating. And we collectively decided that we would scrap one of the days for all the design works, and instead we would replace it with business. So overnight, I then worked on a quick agenda and the type of things that we could cover. And that day, we all sat around a table and we went one by one around each florist, understanding about their business. And I then taught them some really straightforward strategies on how they could really change their businesses. And it was one of those, it was such a pivotal day and such a pivotal moment. It was very emotional. There were so many tears. And I could just sort of see the frustration. And I think so often people were so excited about creating these amazing designs, but actually their businesses, it wouldn't take very much for their businesses to be extraordinary and for them to be able to thrive. And I realized that I was an okay designer, but actually I could help so much more with people in their businesses. And I think it's because I obviously understand creatives deeply. And I understood their struggles. I'd been there. I'd been through everything. I plenty of ups and downs. I've shared all the amazing stories, but there are just as many failures and complete disasters in my business as well, as in every business. And that just felt so right and so exciting. So in that moment, I knew that I wanted eventually to be supporting. It was specifically florists at that time on the business side. And that was about 5 years ago. So it was been a very, very purposely, a very, very slow transition because I knew I couldn't go from floristry to suddenly teaching business. It just didn't make any sense. So it was a very purposeful, very slow transition towards that. And as I began to share more and more business strategies and ideas with florists, I was then beginning to be asked by creatives, specifically interior designers, about sort of business ideas as well. So I began to help and support them, but just sort of not sort of outside of work, just sort of friends and friends of friends. And I then realized that my approach to business wasn't just going to help florists, but it could help all creatives. So that's when I began to focus on helping all creatives rather than just florists. And for me, what I had realized, I think, sort of going back into the early days, I had bought every possible business book. I listened to podcasts, didn't really exist right at the beginning, but as podcasts came out, I would just devour every bit of information I could about business. But I realized that so much of what was being taught didn't apply directly to creatives. And quite often the business strategies were very rigid and they required quite specific frameworks. And I began to realize that that wasn't how I'd set up my business and how I grew my business. I'd done it very much intuitively and in a very, very different way. And it was quite systematic, but I hadn't quite so realized that at the time. So when I began to actually really deeply understand how I was doing it, I realized it was something that I could then share with other people and it would have big impacts on them as well. And one of the biggest realizations that I had was what creators weren't doing was often they were looking at other businesses. They could see other businesses being hugely successful. And it was a very natural reaction to not necessarily copy, but sort of replicate or be inspired by what other people were doing. And what I'd always done was understand what it was that I was really good at. There are so many things that I'm incredibly bad at, but there are some things that I'm very good at. And I had based my entire business around those strengths. And because of that, I was able to create my designs in a different way. I was able to do my marketing, my communication in a very different way. My story was very different. My pricing was also very different. And because I was looking at things in a very different way to others, I wasn't looking at other businesses. And because of that, I was so focused on what I was doing. Yes, of course, I was looking at what other kind of designs people were doing, because I think that's really important to make sure you're aware of what other people are doing in your industry. But I was very, very focused on my direction and what I was doing. So I think that really, really helped me. So that is exactly what I now teach people to do.
And I'm sure there are people listening to this who are either thinking about setting up their own business or are creators and in their own business. So how do they get hold of you? How do they get advice from you? What should they do?
So I have a weekly podcast called Passion to Profit. And because it sort of neatly says exactly what I hope creators will do. So that comes out every Thursday. They can find that on my website, which is philippacraddock.com. And I just recently launched something that I am incredibly proud of called the Base Notes. And the Base Notes is a very, very neat program. It's a set of 9 PDF guides that are beautifully put together, but most importantly, they help creatives feel like legitimate business owners. So it's very much on a sort of a mindset basis. It's deeply understanding what they are brilliant at. And I think so often when you're so good at something, you don't realize it because it becomes so easily to you. So I take you through a series of action points that really for you to really understand where your unique strengths are. And then I explain how you place that at the full foundation of your business. And it's extraordinary. The transformations from that are absolutely miraculous, that people have said how it unclutters everything, how they finally feel like a business owner. There's one entire base note that is all about how you can completely reframe the idea of not feeling worthy about your business and how you can feel like a proper business owner. I think it's one of the hardest things that creatives have to deal with. It's the idea that they're kind of playing at their work rather than actually being an entrepreneur. And they are. I think it's that whole thing, that the number of people that come up with business ideas, but that it's so few the number of people that actually do it. So to be creative and to set up a business, you have taken an enormous leap. And I think so often people don't recognize that. So it's one of those guides that really helps you understand that you've already done something that's quite extraordinary, that many people have not achieved and will never achieve. So it's really celebrating that element and making sure that you've got a very, very clear foundation to your business.
And if you look forward, what are your hopes and aspirations for 5 years from now?
Oh my goodness.
So much with it over the last 5. What about the next 5?
Oh my goodness, I'm so excited about the next few years. So for me, I want to have the biggest impact that I can on creatives. I want creatives to feel like legitimate business owners. I want creatives to have thriving businesses they are so incredibly proud of. I think where we are in the world with the growth of AI and systems and processes, I think there is a phenomenal opportunity for creatives. I think we as humans, we're going to want more and more human-made things. We want that human connection. And I want to make sure that creatives have these amazing businesses that just function in such a straightforward way for them to focus on their creativity and just to feel really confident in what they're doing. And it's that idea of meeting somebody initially who feels a little bit sort of lacking in confidence and just not sure exactly the direction they should go in. And I can see so easily it takes just a couple of tweaks. It really isn't very much. And they can then have a business that brings them the income that they need, but also so much more than that. It brings them just an absolute sense of fulfillment and enjoyment and confidence and excitement and working with the type of clients that they want to work with, creating the designs and work that they want to create. And I know how possible it is. So I want to be able to reach as many people as I can do to be able to support them in that. And I think also what's so great about it, it's not teaching somebody sort of these rigid processes. I'm effectively holding up a mirror. That's what I'm trying to do with every single thing through the podcast, through the base notes and the programs that are going to be coming out. I'm effectively holding up a mirror to show people how brilliant they already are, and how they can just emphasize those and bring that out. So I think it's probably the neatest way to explain it, is coming up with clever ways for people to really understand who they are and what they're brilliant at.
Well, I wish you every success with that, as I know everybody listening to this podcast will. And thank you for sharing your absolutely amazing story, from the corporate world, from your early dyslexia to finding something where you could set up your own business, to making it phenomenally successful, and then now looking to help others. It's a really inspirational journey. So, Philippa, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.